This is John Gatta, President and CEO of ECRA Group, and today I'm going to talk to you about some techniques that you can use to ensure that a transition from SAT to ACT does not disrupt your assessment program. So the first thing that we need to cover is that, as you all know, the SAT has a mathematics component and an evidence-based reading and writing component, and those sum to a composite score, while the ACT has a math, reading, English, and science score, and those are average to arrive at a composite score. But what we need to realize is behind this are some latent constructs, the unobservable constructs that we're ultimately interested in understanding. And when you think about English language arts, that maps onto the evidence-based reading and writing score for SAT and maps onto the reading and English scores for ACT, while the math construct maps onto the math component of the SAT and the math component of the ACT. So to think about the relationships between these scores, because ultimately what we're interested in knowing is, can these scores be exchanged? Can they be used in an exchangeable way to where we can essentially move forward without paying too much attention of where the test scores came from? And while there are differences in the tests, and while they certainly do not align to the same test blueprints, the correlation suggests that for most applications, we can exchange SAT and ACT scores for use in a variety of cases. And so when you think about the math components, those correlate at 0.89. The ELA components, they correlate at 0.88. And when you look at the composite scores, they correlate at a 0.93. Now, 0.93, these are the kinds of correlations that you would expect even from a test correlated to itself. So if you were to take the ACT or ask a student to take the ACT, ask them to come back in a few days and take the ACT again, you're not going to get a correlation really much higher, if any higher than 0.93. And that would be the same thing for the SAT. If you asked a student to take the SAT, come back a few days later, take the SAT again, you're going to get correlations around the same level. So what does that mean? That means while we know that the tests are different, we know that they're structured differently, for most use cases, we can use some simple techniques and ultimately just use these scores in an exchangeable way so that we can proceed as we always have. But in order to do that, we have to understand a few different concepts as it relates to exchanging scores with one another. So there's three terms: equating, linking, and concordance. And these are terms that you may have heard, but we have to make sure that we understand the differences. So when we talk about equating, this really refers to statistical methods to ensure comparability of scores from different forms of the same test. Equating adjusts for differences in test difficulty, but not differences in content. So equating methodologies, when you think about a student who takes the ACT or the SAT, they actually don't take necessarily the same version of that test. Students take different forms of the test that have different items. Those forms have different difficulty. And so what the equating methodology does is to ensure that, let's say, for example, on the ACT, even though students a form of the ACT test that differs in difficulty, the equating methodology maps it to a common scale of 1 to 36 so that you as educators can use that 1 to 36 scale without having to understand or keep track of which forms were more or less difficult. Linking, on the other hand, refers to statistical methods to ensure comparability of scores from different tests with similar but not identical content. Linking considers both test difficulty and test content. So from a conceptual standpoint, we are talking about the relationship between SAT and ACT as more of a linking concept, right? So we know that they're not exactly the same test. We know that they don't come from the same test blueprints. We know that their content is very similar, but it's not identical. So in concept, it's linking. But ultimately, concordance, this is the tricky one because it refers to equating methods applied to a linking context. And what I mean by that is concordance tables provide a converted score that represents the score of an individual student that they would have likely achieved had they taken the other test on the exact same day under the exact same conditions. So the interesting thing about concordance tables that all of you probably have used at some point or another is that the scores that come back from concordance tables represent sort of a converted score, that what is the equivalent score on the other test if in fact a student would have taken taken them on the exact same day under the exact same conditions, not considering any error associated with the retesting at all. But the interesting part of that is that concordance tables do not represent the score a student is likely to actually get if they were to actually sit and take the exam. And so the important part to understand about that is there are cases when to use and not to use concordance tables. And so we'd like to use concordance tables to convert existing student scores for use in statistical analysis or for use within a district policy or procedure. And so if you think about the existing scores that you have on students on the SAT, you can go ahead and convert those to the ACT scale and then use those in longitudinal analysis or to administer other policies and procedures. And that's really what concordance tables were designed to do. But what you can't use concordance tables for is to predict how a student will score on the other test should they take the test at some point in the future. So once we get to a use case about what do we predict a student will get on the ACT at some point in the future, a year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now, concordance tables are not going to be useful. The other context that concordance tables are not going to be used is to convert aggregate statistics. Remember, concordance tables deal with the translation of individual records, not aggregate records. So we can't take an ACT average score, like your school average of what they had on the SAT or ACT, and then use the concordance tables to find out what an equivalent average would be on the other test. The proper way to do that would be to convert all the records at the individual record level and then to do the averaging or statistical analysis on the records in a way that that makes sense. And so let's go ahead and look at a few use cases for how you could apply concordance tables and prediction models. One of the use cases that you might consider is to use concordance tables to convert historical SAT scores to ACT scores so that you can preserve the ability to monitor proficiency and college readiness trends over time. And so to do that, we're going to go ahead and jump into the ECRA platform and look at some longitudinal charts here. And so what you'll see here, one of the charts that I looked at is we're looking at mathematics on the SAT, and we're looking at 3 years of proficiency levels on the SAT. But if you were to use concordance tables to equate that, you could just go ahead and convert that to, see here, an equated ACT. And so what we did here was essentially take scores that had already existed on the SAT scale in grade 11, right? When historically converted those to the ACT scales, now I have 3 years of ACT historical performance, and as the state transitions to the ACT, I can keep adding to that so that I can look at things longitudinally. So even at year 1, I could have 4 or 5 years of historical performance on the ACT right there at year 1. And so that's a nice way and a straightforward way to use these concordance tables to convert historical scores so that you can use in statistical analysis. So another way that you might consider using this is to use concordance tables to convert existing SAT scores to ACT scores for use in a prediction model. And then you can predict future ACT scores from prior PSAT scores in grades 8, 9, and or 10. And so this is really the context of, I want to know now as students take the PSAT, they're going to take the ACT a year from now or 2 years from now, how can I predict what they're likely to perform on that ACT sort of a year or so from now. And so let's go ahead and again jump into the ECRA platform and look at this from a projection standpoint or a prediction standpoint. And so what you see here is a prediction dashboard where at grade 11 we can predict both what a student's going to score on the SAT and what they're going to score on the ACT, regardless of what they took in the past. And so I'm going to go ahead and jump into this particular graph that is looking at the relationship between the grade 10 spring PSAT mathematics score and what we would predict that they would get on the grade 11 spring SAT score a year a year later. And so what you can see here is that you can predict this very well. And this should come to no surprise because this is what you've been doing in the past using PSAT scores to predict SAT scores. And then you can do interesting things like ask those that are predicted, maybe to not meet the college readiness benchmark in the future. You can slice and dice that by other variables and building variables, but this should feel familiar to you because this is what you've been doing with the College Board suite. But you can also do essentially the same thing by looking at the ACT. And so I can look at the exact same graph, but look at it from the standpoint of looking at the relationship between the PSAT and the ACT. And so all I've done here, these are the exact same kids with the exact same scores, but we've exchanged the SAT scores for the ACT scores and then run them through a prediction model so that we can do essentially the same thing we have been doing. But instead of looking at the end assessment being the SAT, now it is the ACT. And the nice thing about that then is you can look at things from a variety of standpoints. You can predict, where students are going to be or certain subgroups are going to be in aggregate a year from now, 2 years from now on the ACT, even though they've taken different assessments leading up to that. So this example, we can see that we're projecting 31% of students to hit the college and career readiness benchmarks on ACT, even though they took the PSAT. And then you could run those projections by subgroups, programs, courses, whatever's of interest to you. And then the next use case I wanted to look at was then how do you use this information to monitor student growth and evaluate program effectiveness regardless of whether a student took the ACT or SAT. So this is the idea of how do we preserve the ability to do program evaluation and use growth metrics to evaluate all of the structures, processes, procedures within the school or within the district. And this proceeds just the same way as all of the other contexts proceed, is that I'm going to hop into this growth dashboard, and I'm just going to look at the actual scores here. And we can see here that now I'm looking at mathematics. I just keep picking mathematics just for the sake of illustration, but you can see here there's composite, there's ELA, and there's mathematics. Again, same exact students, but we've converted the SAT scores to ACT scores. So you can see here we're looking at growth for the composite here. If you were looking at it terminated to the SATs, 0.15, and spring ACT, 0.15. This is in the metric of an effect size. But let's go down to mathematics. And just like before with the spring SAT, we can look at the relationship between the PSAT and the SAT and look at sort of where students were related to that. And then we could drill down and say, like, for example, did the algebra tutoring result in a significant and positive impact or accelerate rates of growth for students on the SAT? And the answer to that is yes, with an effect size of 0.57. But we could have done the exact same thing even though we didn't have the ACT using the ACT. So here's the exact same students, but we're going to hop into the chart now with the metric of ACT. And again, all we've done here is we have exchanged the old SAT scores for ACT scores and then fit the prediction model so that we can interact with it the same way. And I could now do the same context of asking the question, did that algebra tutoring have a significant impact on student growth? We're at 0.57 with the SAT, we're at 0.56 with the ACT. Obviously, these are not perfectly mathematically exchangeable scores, so you'll see some differences, but in our experience, all these differences are negligible. And so you can proceed in using the scores just as if they were on the original metric. And then again, the nice thing about that is you can continue then to run more aggregate reports that look at the effect size for various programs, processes, interventions, subgroups, whatever it is that's part of your school improvement process. And the last context that I want to take a look at is using concordance tables to convert an existing individual student score to apply a district policy or procedure. So in this case now, all we're interested in is, and this happens a lot in schools, is how can we just look up a student's score and see it on both metrics, even though they may have only taken the SAT or the ACT. And again, so let's hop into the platform here, and we're going to hop into ECRA's learner profile, and I'm going to take, for an example, a particular student, and what you see here is when you look up a student, you can say, well, here's what they actually got on the SAT, that's their score right here, but then here's their equated score on the ACT. And again, this was done just using the concordance table. So this is a great way to just during the transition period, provide users within your building or within your school district the opportunity to use either score, whichever score that they want. And so that's one of the things I would recommend, is just using these concordance tables, translate all the scores, and then report both of them so that you have them. Now you want to make sure that you indicate which one's equated, but for the most part, then you can use those as as you would have had they actually taken the original test. And so, in closing, what I would say is, as you think about the transition from SAT to ACT, the most important thing to continue to do is test. And so whether or not you're going to continue for one more year with the College Board Suite, or depending on what happens at the state level, whether or not you will shift to the ACT sequence of exams, the most important piece is that just to continue the same testing cycle that you have been doing in grades 8, 9, 10, 11, or whatever you have been doing within your program, because you're going to be able to use the techniques in this video to ensure that whatever happens in the future, you're going to be able to preserve the ability to operate just as you have in the past. So if you do have any questions, go ahead and email me, or you can send me a message on Twitter at @JLGatta, but happy to talk more about this or answer any questions. So I hope that this was helpful, and let me know if there's any additional questions, and I can follow up with more.